When they thought they were going to walk free, the parrot started to talk. Judge Robert Mitchell adjusted his reading glasses and began reviewing his notes to finalize the trial that had dragged on for more than 6 months. Prosecutor Sarah Coleman, with an expression of frustration, organized her documents, knowing that despite all her efforts, she hadn't been able to gather enough evidence to incriminate Harrison in the case of embezzling millions from the New Pathways Foundation, which was supposed to help underprivileged children from the inner-city neighborhoods. In the gallery, reporters whispered while waiting for what seemed to be the anticlimax of one of the most talked-about cases of the year. Among those present, a humble-looking elderly woman attracted attention due to an unusual detail. A blue and green-feathered parrot rested quietly on her right shoulder. The final arguments phase is closed. Given the absence of compelling evidence presented by the prosecution, this court is ready to deliver its decision, declared Judge Mitchell. It was at that moment that the silence was broken by a shrill voice. "Thief, I saw everything. Harrison stole the money, 50 million in the office safe." All eyes turned to the source of those unexpected words. The parrot, until then silent, was now agitated on the elderly woman's shoulder. Confusion erupted in the courtroom. The defense attorney, Mr. Lawrence Porter, immediately stood up. "Your Honor, this is outrageous, a circus. I request that order be maintained in this courtroom." The elderly woman, identified as Mrs. Martha Jenkins, former housekeeper of Harrison's mansion for more than 15 years, tried to calm the parrot, named Blue. "Silence," ordered the judge, repeatedly banging his gavel. "Ma'am, control that animal or I'll have to ask for its removal from the courtroom." Prosecutor Sarah, however, saw an unexpected light in a case that seemed lost. "Your Honor, I request that the court record what just happened. This parrot may contain information relevant to the case." The session was suspended for 30 minutes. While the judge, prosecution, and defense discussed the unusual occurrence behind the scenes, when they returned, the tension was palpable. Richard Harrison, previously confident, now showed signs of uneasiness. His fixed gaze on Mrs. Jenkins and her parrot revealed a concern that wasn't there minutes before. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Judge Mitchell, after consulting legal precedents and hearing arguments from both sides, made an unprecedented decision. As an exceptional measure, I authorize the inclusion of the parrot as an element for additional investigation. The session is suspended and will resume in 1 week. Time for technical analyses to be conducted regarding the credibility of the animal's vocalizations. In the days that followed, news of the witness parrot went viral on social media. Television programs debated whether an animal could or could not serve as evidence in a court of law. Animal behavior specialists were summoned by both the defense and prosecution. In Sarah Coleman's apartment, located in Brooklyn, the prosecutor spent sleepless nights researching similar cases in international jurisprudence. Her assistant, Jessica Barnes, a young recently graduated lawyer, brought stacks of books and documents. "I found something, Ms. Coleman," exclaimed Jessica one Friday night. "In India in 2016, a parrot's testimony helped clarify a complex case. It wasn't decisive, but it was considered as an indication." "Excellent, Jessica, but we need something more robust. Harrison has the best lawyers in the country. We can't depend solely on the Indian precedent." Meanwhile, at Richard Harrison's mansion in the Hamptons, the businessman met with his legal team. Mr. Lawrence Porter seemed less confident than before. "Richard, we need to talk seriously. This parrot situation is absurd, but it's gaining traction. The media won't talk about anything else." "It's ridiculous. A parrot can't be a witness. This won't amount to anything," replied Harrison, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "Don't underestimate the situation. That bird repeated exact values, precise dates. How does it know about the 50 million? How does it know about the office safe?" Harrison stared at the lawyer, his longtime friend. "What are you implying, Lawrence?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm asking how we're going to explain this to the judge." The next day, in a laboratory at New York University, Professor Dr. Emily Thompson, a specialist in animal cognition, examined Blue the parrot. Mrs. Jenkins remained by her side, nervous about the whole situation. Dr. Blue has always been smart. Ever since Mr. Harrison brought him back from a trip to the Amazon 8 years ago, he was always in the office, listening to everything. Mrs. Jenkins, it's important to understand that parrots can repeat phrases, but they don't necessarily comprehend their meaning, explained the specialist while recording the animal's vocalizations. But Blue does understand. When I say I'm going to give him mango, he gets all excited. If I mention a bath, he runs away and hides. Dr. Thompson smiled patiently while continuing her tests. After hours of analysis, something surprised her. Blue wasn't just repeating random phrases. He seemed to associate certain words with specific contexts. "Safe open, 50 million, repeated the parrot when the specialist showed a photo of a safe similar to the one that existed in Harrison's office. "This is fascinating," muttered the scientist, making detailed notes. In court, a week later, the atmosphere was one of expectation. The room was packed with journalists from all over, the United States and even international correspondents. The case of the witness parrot had captured worldwide attention. Judge Mitchell entered, and everyone stood. After the initial procedures, Prosecutor Sarah presented Dr. Emily Thompson's report. "Your Honor, the scientific report indicates that the parrot Blue demonstrates unusual behavior. He not only repeats phrases, but establishes contextual connections. When presented with images related to the suspicious transactions, he vocalizes specific information about values, dates, and locations that coincide with the suspicious financial records of the New Pathways Foundation." Mr. Porter immediately stood up. "Your Honor, with all due respect to science, we are facing an absurd situation. A parrot cannot be a witness in a criminal case. This violates all principles of due process." "Mr. Porter, we are not treating the animal as a formal witness, but as a potential source of clues that may lead to concrete evidence," replied the judge. "Continue, Ms. Coleman." "Thank you, Your Honor. In addition to Dr. Thompson's report, we have located Mr. Harrison's former partner, Mr. Michael Bennett, who was residing abroad and has agreed to testify via video conference. Richard Harrison, seated at the defense table, visibly paled. His lawyer leaned over to whisper something in his ear, but he just shook his head. Michael Bennett appeared on the large screen installed in the courtroom. A middle-aged man with graying hair, he seemed nervous. After taking the oath, he began his testimony. "I worked with Richard for more than 20 years. We were like brothers until I discovered the scheme to divert funds from the foundation. When I confronted him, he offered to include me in the scheme. I refused, and that's why I left the company, moving to England, fearing retaliation." "Mr. Bennett, do you have knowledge of meetings where the diversion of funds from the New Pathways Foundation was discussed?" asked Sarah. "Yes, several meetings took place in Richard's office. He always kept that parrot nearby, said it was his lucky charm. I never imagined the bird might be recording everything." "Do you have knowledge of the value mentioned by the parrot? 50 million? That was exactly the total value planned for the diversion, divided into 5 operations of 10 million each. As far as I know, 3 operations were completed before I left the company." Michael Bennett's testimony continued for more than 2 hours, detailing dates, values, and operations that coincided with the phrases repeated by Blue the parrot. The defense tried to disqualify the witness, suggesting there was personal resentment against Harrison, but the impact of his statements was undeniable. While the trial proceeded, investigative journalist David Reynolds from the New York Times received a package of anonymous files in his email. They were audio recordings made during meetings in Harrison's office. After verifying the authenticity of the files with forensic audio specialists, David contacted Prosecutor Sarah. "These recordings change everything," stated the journalist, delivering the material. "They are authentic and coincide with the phrases that the parrot repeats." The prosecution requested the inclusion of the recordings as evidence, which generated intense legal debate. The defense argued that the recordings were illegal, made without consent. After 2 weeks of analysis, Judge Mitchell decided to accept the material as evidence, considering the public interest involved. In a last attempt to save his client, Mr. Porter hired an international bird specialist, Dr. Hans Weber, who testified that parrots could be trained to repeat any phrase. It is perfectly possible that Mrs. Jenkins trained this parrot to pronounce incriminating phrases against Mr. Harrison, stated the German specialist. Dr. Weber, how long would it take to train a parrot to repeat complex phrases like those Blue pronounces, including specific numbers, names, and situations? Asked Sarah in cross-examination. Well, it depends on the bird, but normally it would take months of intensive training. And are you aware that Mrs. Jenkins was fired by Harrison just 3 weeks before the start of this trial? The specialist hesitated, and the court understood the implication. There wouldn't have been enough time for the alleged training. Tension reached its peak when the prosecution presented an old security footage from Harrison's office, where the businessman could be clearly seen in meetings with others involved in the scheme, openly discussing the diversions, while Blue the parrot remained on his perch observing everything. Your Honor, this footage confirms that the parrot was present during discussions of the fraudulent scheme, argued Sarah. He wasn't trained to repeat these phrases. He heard them directly from the defendant's mouth and his accomplices. Richard Harrison, who had maintained an arrogant posture throughout the process, began to show signs of desperation. In a moment of tension, he abruptly stood up. This is a farce. A parrot cannot condemn me. I am Richard Harrison. I built an empire. I won't fall because of a damned— Order in the court, interrupted the judge, banging his gavel. Mr. Harrison, contain yourself or you will be removed from the room. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The following days were of intense legal battle. Judge Mitchell seemed inclined to disregard the parrot's testimony, citing the lack of solid legal precedents. However, the prosecution found an old case in a Seattle court from 1982 where a parrot's vocalizations had been used as clues to initiate an investigation that resulted in a conviction. In his chambers, Judge Robert Mitchell spent nights studying the unusual case. His clerk, Ms. Nancy Fields, expressed concern. Judge Mitchell, you know that this decision will create precedent. For the first time, an animal's vocalizations will be considered in a high-level trial. Nancy, it's not the parrot condemning Harrison. It's the evidence that his vocalizations led us to discover. The animal was just the catalyst that allowed us to connect the dots. In Central Park, Sarah Coleman walked alongside her assistant Jessica, discussing the final details for the closing arguments. Do you think we'll succeed, Ms. Coleman? Asked the young assistant. It depends on what the judge decides about the admissibility of evidence triggered by the parrot. Without that, our case is weakened. The whole country is following this. I've never seen a case generate so much commotion. Sarah smiled, tired. It's because it touches on something profound. The idea that truth always finds a way, even through the most unlikely messenger. On the morning of the verdict, the courthouse was surrounded by crowds. Pro- and anti-Harrison groups demonstrated on the steps. National and international press competed for space to cover the outcome of the case that had become known worldwide as the Parrot trial. Inside the courtroom, there was absolute silence when Judge Mitchell entered. Mrs. Jenkins was present, with Blue the parrot, who remained unusually quiet as if understanding the solemnity of the moment. Before delivering my decision, began the judge, I must emphasize the exceptional nature of this process. The circumstances that brought us here are, at the very least, extraordinary. However, justice is not bound by formalities when the search for truth imposes itself. The judge paused, looking directly at Richard Harrison. This court decides to admit as valid evidence the vocalizations of Blue the parrot, not for their direct testimonial value, but because they triggered an investigation that produced concrete and irrefutable evidence. The anonymous recordings, Mr. Michael Bennett's testimony, the security footage, and the subsequent financial analysis form a solid body of evidence. At that moment, as if sensing the crucial moment, Blue the parrot became agitated on Mrs. Jenkins's shoulder and let out a new vocalization, money hidden. In the garden, under the statue. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge ordered silence, but the new information had already been registered by everyone present. Sarah Coleman immediately requested, Your Honor, I request authorization. for a search and seizure at the defendant's property based on this new information. "Granted," replied the judge, "and I order that the defendant remain in custody until the completion of this search." Richard Harrison's expression was one of pure horror. His empire was beginning to crumble before his eyes because of a parrot. The search at Harrison's mansion was conducted that same day. In the garden under a statue of Neptune, the police found a waterproof metal box containing incriminating documents and a flash drive with files detailing the entire embezzlement scheme, including offshore accounts and names of other high-ranking individuals involved. The case that seemed destined for acquittal transformed into one of the biggest corruption convictions in recent U.S. history. Richard Harrison was sentenced to 15 years in prison and a fine of $100 million. 6 other businessmen and 3 politicians were implicated in the documents found, triggering a new series of investigations. As Harrison was led out of the courtroom, he cast a final hate-filled glance at Mrs. Jenkins and her parrot. The elderly woman who had faithfully served the family for decades until being dismissed without just cause or compensation simply lowered her head. There was no joy in her victory, just the relief of seeing justice done. On the courthouse steps, surrounded by journalists, Prosecutor Sarah Coleman made a succinct statement. "This case teaches us that truth can find unexpected ways to come to light. No one is above the law, no matter how powerful they may be." When questioned about Blue the parrot's future, the prosecutor smiled. "I believe he deserves a golden perch and mangoes at will for the rest of his life." In the months that followed, the witness parrot case became the subject of study in law schools around the world. Debates about the limits of evidence admissibility and the legal definition of the concept of witness were intensified. Mrs. Jenkins, for her part, refused million-dollar offers for interviews and books, preferring to return to her simple life in Queens, always accompanied by Blue. David Reynolds, the journalist who received the anonymous recordings, won the Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the case. In his acceptance speech, he reflected, "Sometimes, truth comes from where we least expect it. A parrot reminded us that there are no absolutely safe secrets when justice needs to prevail." The impact of the case went beyond the judiciary. The New Pathways Foundation, after a complete restructuring and under new direction, managed to recover part of the misappropriated resources and expand its programs for underprivileged communities. Children who previously had no hope of quality education now attended modern schools, built with money recovered from Harrison's scheme. In one of these schools in the South Bronx, a colorful mural displayed the figure of a blue and green parrot with the inscription, "Blue the Guardian of Truth." Children learned that honesty always finds a voice, even in the most unlikely circumstances. Michael Bennett, the former partner who testified against Harrison, returned to the United States and decided to dedicate himself to social projects. Using his business experience for positive causes, he founded an NGO focused on transparency and combating corruption in charitable institutions. Richard's biggest mistake was believing that power and money placed him above consequences, declared Michael in a lecture to young entrepreneurs, but even a parrot could see through his facade of respectability. In Prosecutor Sarah Coleman's office, a new photo adorned the wall, she, smiling, next to Mrs. Jenkins and Blue the parrot. Below a simple inscription, "Justice comes in all sizes and colors." For Sarah, the case represented not just a professional victory, but a profound lesson in perseverance. For months, she had faced the feeling of imminent defeat, fighting against a system that often seemed to favor the powerful. The turnaround caused by a simple parrot reminded her of why she had chosen a legal career. The fundamental belief that truth deserves to be defended, regardless of the chances of success. Her assistant Jessica, now promoted to assistant prosecutor, thanks to her work on the case, often reflected on the lessons learned. "The Harrison case taught me that we should always investigate until the last minute, explore every possibility, no matter how unlikely it may seem." In Mrs. Jenkins's small house in Queens, with a view of the East River, life went on peacefully. The backyard had been transformed into a small aviary where Blue enjoyed more space and the company of other birds. Regularly, Students of law, veterinary, medicine and animal psychology visited the place for studies, always under the careful supervision of the elderly woman, who had become a kind of reluctant celebrity. Blue has always been special, she told visitors. Since he was a chick, he observed everything, learned everything. Mr. Harrison found it amusing, said Blue was his confidant because a parrot could not snitch on him. Ironic, isn't it? Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out. Now continuing. In Washington, D.C., the case generated discussions in Congress about the need for stricter laws for the oversight of charitable foundations. A bill, informally nicknamed the Blue Law, proposed greater transparency and control over the use of resources intended for social causes. During the debates, Senator Paul Thompson, author of the bill, argued, "The Harrison case exposed a vulnerability in our system. We cannot depend on parrots to discover misappropriations of resources that should help those most in need." Meanwhile, in the medium-security penitentiary where he was serving his sentence, Richard Harrison faced the harsh reality of his new life. The man who once commanded a business empire now lived confined to a 9-square-meter cell. His lawyers continued to appeal the sentence, but the evidence was too solid to offer real hope of reversal. In a rare visit, Mr. Lawrence Porter, his lawyer and longtime friend, found a dejected Harrison without the gleam of arrogance that had always characterized him. 15 years, Lawrence, because of a damn parrot, lamented the businessman. It wasn't the parrot, Richard. It was your own actions. The parrot just repeated what you said when you thought no one important was listening. Harrison looked at his friend with a mixture of resignation and regret. You know what torments me the most? That sense of impunity I cultivated for so many years. The certainty that I was above the rules. I really believed that. No one is above the rules, Richard. Not even you. Leaving the penitentiary, Lawrence Porter reflected on his own participation in the case. As a lawyer, he had fulfilled his role of offering the best possible defense to his client, but as a citizen, he felt a secret relief at the triumph of justice. At New York University, Dr. Emily Thompson, the specialist who had analyzed Blue the parrot's behavior, published a revolutionary study on cognition in birds, especially Amazon parrots. Her work shed new light on these birds' ability to not only imitate sounds, but to understand complex contexts and associations. The Blue case made us question many of our premises about animal intelligence, explained the scientist in an interview with Scientific American. We discovered that these animals possess cognitive capabilities far beyond what we imagined, including surprisingly sophisticated contextual and associative memory. On a Saturday afternoon, 6 months after the verdict, Sarah Coleman visited Mrs. Jenkins at her house in Queens. The two women, united by extraordinary circumstances, had developed an unlikely friendship. Sitting on the porch with a view of the river, they shared a coffee while Blue delighted in fresh mango slices. "How are you adapting to fame?" asked Sarah, smiling. "Oh, Miss Coleman, this is all very strange for an old woman like me. People stop me on the street, want to take pictures with Blue. I receive letters from all over the country, even from abroad. But deep down, I just want my quiet life back." "And what will you do with the compensation you received from Harrison?" Mrs. Jenkins smiled, a youthful gleam illuminating her wrinkled face. "I bought this little house, of course, but the rest... Well, the rest goes to a project for preserving parrots in the Amazon. Seems fair, doesn't it? After all, I owe everything to Blue." The parrot, as if understanding the conversation, let out a cheerful "Blue smart, Blue intelligent," making both women burst into laughter. Meanwhile, at the New York Times newsroom, David Reynolds was finalizing a book about the case. The Parrot That Changed Justice promised to be a bestseller even before its release. In the preface, the journalist wrote, "There are moments when the extraordinary erupts into the ordinary, challenging our preconceived notions about how the world works. The Harrison case was one of those moments when a simple blue and green feathered parrot shook the pillars of the judicial system and forced us to rethink fundamental concepts like witness, evidence, and truth. But above all, it was a powerful reminder that justice, as a moral force of the universe, always finds a way to prevail, even if through the most unlikely of messengers. The impact of the case extended beyond American borders. Universities around the world included the witness Parrot case in their law curricula. At Harvard, Cambridge, and the Sorbonne, professors discussed the legal and philosophical implications of the case that challenged century-old legal conventions. At an international law conference in Geneva, Judge Robert Mitchell, invited as the keynote speaker, reflected on his decision. When faced with that unusual situation, I realized I was facing a choice: cling to the cold letter of the law or honor its deeper spirit, which is the search for truth and justice. I chose the second path, aware of the risks and criticism I would face. The auditorium, filled with jurists from dozens of countries, gave him a standing ovation. The blue case, as it had become known internationally, had become a symbol of how judicial systems could adapt to extraordinary circumstances without compromising fundamental principles. In New York, life went on. The New Pathways Foundation, now under transparent administration, expanded its programs. In one of its new units in the Bronx, children who previously lived in precarious conditions received quality education, food, and medical care. At the entrance of the building, a discreet plaque reminded, "Truth can come from the most unexpected places." To celebrate the first anniversary of the sentence, a group of street artists created a huge graffiti on the outer wall of the courthouse, the image of a blue and green parrot holding the scales of justice. The work, initially unauthorized, was so well received by the public that authorities decided to preserve it as part of the city's cultural heritage. The 6 businessmen and 3 politicians implicated in the documents found at Harrison's property now faced their own trials. The Blue Effect, as the press nicknamed it, generated a wave of investigations into foundations and NGOs across the country, exposing other embezzlement schemes. Michael Bennett, in partnership with Sarah Coleman, created a fund to finance independent investigations into corruption in charitable institutions. The Sentinel Fund offered legal support and protection to whistleblowers, encouraging more people to have the courage to expose irregularities. The lesson we take from the Harrison case is that silence only benefits those who operate in the shadows, declared Michael during the fund's launch. We need to create an environment where truth can flourish, where witnesses, human or not, find protection and shelter. In his second year of imprisonment, Richard Harrison underwent a personal transformation. Removed from the power and luxury that had always defined him, the businessman found time to reflect on his choices. He began participating in a rehabilitation program, offering entrepreneurship classes to other inmates. During a visit from his daughter Caroline, who had cut ties with him after the scandal, Harrison confessed, "You know, honey, I carry a parrot with me wherever I go now. Here in my mind, it's the voice of my conscience that I ignored for so many years." Caroline, initially skeptical about her father's sincerity, began to notice a genuine change in his attitudes and values. Gradually, the relationship between father and daughter began to rebuild on more honest foundations. For Sarah Coleman, the case represented a watershed in her career. Promoted to head of the Anti-Corruption Prosecution Office, she implemented special protocols for evaluating unconventional evidence, ensuring that future cases could benefit from the experience of the Blue case. In an interview with Time magazine, the prosecutor reflected, "The judicial system, like any human institution, needs to evolve and adapt." The Harrison case taught us that sometimes truth reaches us in ways that our law books didn't anticipate. Our responsibility is to be open to recognizing it, regardless of its source. The evidence revealed by the case led to a comprehensive audit of all charitable foundations associated with Harrison's business group. It was discovered that resource diversion was a systemic practice, affecting not only the New Pathways Foundation, but several other apparently charitable institutions that served as a facade for illicit operations. Attorney Lawrence Porter, after a profound crisis of conscience, decided to distance himself from clients involved in corruption, even if it meant a significant reduction in his income. His new firm specialized in environmental law and animal protection, a choice that many attributed to the influence of the Blue case on his professional life. Blue the parrot, in turn, became a national celebrity. Zoos and conservation centers offered astronomical sums to acquire him, but Mrs. Jenkins refused all proposals. For her, Blue was not an attraction or a symbol. He was a friend, a companion, who had been by her side in difficult times. One Sunday morning, while watching a special report about the case on television, Mrs. Jenkins smiled as she saw old images of her years working at Harrison's mansion. She recalled how the businessman treated the parrot like a toy, openly talking about his schemes in the presence of the animal he considered incapable of understanding. "Look, Blue," she said to the parrot perched on her shoulder. "Who would have thought you would change the history of American justice?" The parrot, as if understanding perfectly, responded with one of his favorite phrases, "Justice for all, justice for all." The phrase, which had never been heard during the trial, made Mrs. Jenkins reflect. Did Blue really understand the concept of justice, or was it just another vocal coincidence? The line between mechanical repetition and conscious understanding seemed increasingly tenuous when it came to that extraordinary parrot. On the third anniversary of the sentence, the New York courthouse inaugurated a special room in its museum, dedicated to the witness parrot case. The exhibition included documents from the process, videos of the trial, Blue's original cage, donated by Mrs. Jenkins, and a detailed timeline of each twist in the case that had captured the world's imagination. During the inauguration ceremony, Supreme Court Justice Edward Roberts observed, "Extraordinary cases like this remind us that law is not a static set of rules, but a living organism that must adapt to the changing realities of society. Judge Mitchell's courage in admitting unconventional evidence teaches us a valuable lesson about the evolutionary nature of justice." In the audience, Sarah Coleman and Jessica Barnes exchanged knowing looks. Both had risked their professional reputations by insisting on the validity of Blue's testimony. Now what seemed a desperate strategy had transformed into a historical precedent. For the children benefited by the programs of the reformed New Pathways Foundation, the case had a special meaning. In schools administered by the foundation, the Blue program taught values of honesty, transparency, and civic courage through playful activities involving the story of the famous parrot. In one of these schools in the Harlem community, little Sophia, 8 years old, raised her hand during a lesson about the case. "Teacher, if I find someone doing something wrong, can I also tell like Blue did?" Teacher Mary smiled, moved by the innocence of the question. "Yes, Sophia, that's exactly what Blue teaches us, that we should have the courage to speak the truth even when it seems no one will believe us." The cultural impact of the case also extended to the arts. An award-winning television miniseries dramatized the story, with renowned actors playing Sarah Coleman, Judge Mitchell, and Richard Harrison. A specially trained parrot played Blue, himself becoming a celebrity. In his 4th year of prison, Richard Harrison requested permission to start a rehabilitation project for wild birds within the penitentiary. To the surprise of many, the Wings of Freedom project became a success, receiving birds rescued from illegal trafficking and preparing them for reintroduction into nature. In a rare interview granted from prison, Harrison explained his motivation. "There is a poetic irony in having my life transformed by a parrot and now dedicating myself to saving other birds. Perhaps it's my way of seeking redemption, of correcting at least a small fraction of the harm I caused." The German specialist, Dr. Hans Weber, who had testified for the defense during the trial, published a study revising his previous positions on cognition in birds. After extensive research inspired by the Blue case, Weber concluded that parrots possessed cognitive capabilities far superior to those previously recognized by science. "The American case forced me to reconsider premises I had held for decades," admitted the scientist. "Today I recognize that we grossly underestimated the intelligence and consciousness of these remarkable birds." In Mrs. Jenkins's small house, life followed its quiet course. At 78 years old, the former housekeeper enjoyed a comfortable retirement, thanks to the compensation received and royalties for the use of Blue's image in books, films, and products. However, The money had changed little in her simple lifestyle. On a spring afternoon, she received a visit from Caroline, Richard Harrison's daughter. The meeting, initially tense, transformed into a sincere conversation between two women marked in different ways by the same man. "My father asked me to bring this," said Caroline, handing over a small package. "He carved it himself in the prison workshop." Inside the box was a delicate wooden sculpture, a parrot with open wings as if in full flight. A small plaque on the base simply said, "For Blue, the messenger of truth." Mrs. Jenkins held the sculpture with trembling hands, tears in her eyes. "Tell your father that Blue and I accept his apologies." On a nearby perch, as if understanding the magnitude of the moment, Blue remained in respectful silence. 5 years after the verdict, the story continued to reverberate in different spheres of American society. The term Blue effect had entered popular vocabulary, referring to situations where an unexpected revelation causes a complete turnaround in a seemingly decided case. In legal literature, the case generated dozens of theses and dissertations, analyzing its implications for evidence theory, the limits of evidence admissibility, and the very philosophy of law. Judge Mitchell, now retired, dedicated himself to lectures and seminars on the topic at universities around the world. The Harrison case taught us that truth and justice are not limited to the paths foreseen in our codes. Sometimes they reach us through unexpected routes, challenging our most ingrained conceptions, reflected the judge in his presentations. Sarah Coleman, in turn, had been appointed to the Federal Court of Appeals, where she continued her crusade against corruption. In her office, she kept framed the front page of the newspaper, announcing Harrison's conviction, with the memorable headline, "Parrot brings justice, businessman convicted for embezzling millions." Her assistant, Jessica Barnes, had followed in her mentor's footsteps, becoming a respected prosecutor, specializing in corruption cases involving charitable institutions. The Blue case had inspired an entire generation of young jurists to seek truth through unconventional paths. At the renovated headquarters of the New Pathways Foundation, which now served more than 10,000 children throughout New York State, a colorful mural portrayed the story that had transformed the institution. In the center of the painting, a blue and green parrot flew over the courthouse, carrying the scales of justice in its beak. For the children who attended the foundation, Blue had become more than a symbol. He was a hero, a defender of the weak and oppressed, living proof that even the smallest voice can be heard when it carries the truth. Michael Bennett, Harrison's former partner, had completely transformed his life. His Sentinel Fund now operated in 5 Latin American countries, offering protection to whistleblowers of corruption. In his autobiography, The Courage to Speak, he dedicated an entire chapter to Blue. "When a parrot showed more moral integrity than many businessmen, I realized it was time to redefine my own values." Blue had nothing to gain by exposing the truth. He just followed the natural impulse to repeat what he had witnessed. In this simplicity lies a profound lesson about integrity that many of us, in our complex lives full of justifications, completely forget. In the 6th year after the verdict, Mrs. Jenkins, now 80 years old, decided to fulfill an old dream, visiting the Amazon, Blue's native region. Accompanied by Sarah Coleman, who had become a close friend, and a team of biologists, she traveled to the Negro River Extractive Reserve. There, in a simple ceremony, she inaugurated the Blue Sanctuary, a protected area dedicated to the preservation of Amazon parrots threatened by illegal wildlife trafficking. The project, financed with part of her compensation, included a rehabilitation center for rescued birds and educational programs for local communities. Blue changed my life, changed American justice, and now is helping to change the destiny of his brothers from the forest, declared the elderly woman, moved during the inauguration. Blue himself, now almost 15 years old, remained healthy and eloquent. His vocabulary had expanded considerably since the trial, and biologists from around the world regularly visited Mrs. Jenkins to study his extraordinary cognitive abilities. During the visit to the Amazon, a special moment moved all those present. When Blue was briefly placed near a tree where wild parrots of the same species lived, he observed them at length as if recognizing his origins. For a moment it seemed he might join the others, returning to natural freedom. But soon, by his own choice, he flew back to Mrs. Jenkins' shoulder. "Blue stays. Blue loves Martha," declared the parrot, bringing tears to the elderly woman's eyes and to all those present. Back in New York, life followed its course. The case that had once dominated headlines gradually became part of history, an extraordinary chapter in the evolution of the American judicial system. However, its effects continued to reverberate in various spheres of society. Richard Harrison, serving his 8th year of sentence, had transformed into an advocate for prison system reform and inmate rehabilitation. His Wings of Freedom project had expanded to other penitentiaries, receiving international recognition for its success rates in the rehabilitation of birds and inmates simultaneously. In a sentence review hearing, Harrison surprised the court by declaring, "I'm not here to ask for a reduction of my sentence. I'm here to thank you for the opportunity for transformation it has provided me. The man who entered this prison 8 years ago no longer exists. And I owe this transformation, ironically, to a parrot that I had the arrogance to underestimate." The judge, impressed with Harrison's sincerity and the proven results of his rehabilitation work, granted him a partial release program, allowing him to expand his projects and occasionally visit schools to share his story as a warning against corruption. In one of these visits to a public school in the Bronx, a small child raised his hand after his lecture. "Do you hate the parrot that put you in prison?" Harrison smiled with tears in his eyes. "No, young man. I am eternally grateful to him. Blue saved me from myself, from the terrible person I was becoming. Sometimes we need to lose everything to find what really matters." 10 years after the historic verdict, a grand ceremony brought together all the protagonists of the case in the auditorium of the National Law School. Sarah Coleman, now a federal Court of Appeals judge, Judge Mitchell, Michael Bennett, David Reynolds, Mrs. Jenkins, and of course Blue the parrot, now almost 20 years old, a respectable age for a parrot in captivity. To the surprise of all present, an unexpected guest joined the ceremony. Richard Harrison, now on parole, granted for his exemplary behavior and the numerous social contributions made during his detention. On stage, side by side, were the accuser, the accused, the judge, and the unlikely whistleblower, an image that perfectly symbolized the extraordinary journey of transformation that all had experienced. 10 years ago, in this same city, we witnessed something that defied all our expectations about how justice works, Sarah spoke. A parrot, seemingly insignificant creature, became the catalyst for a profound transformation not only in our judicial system, but in each of us who lived this extraordinary story. When his turn came to speak, Harrison addressed the parrot directly, who was watching everything from Mrs. Jenkins's shoulder. "Thank you, Blue. You showed me that no secret remains, hidden forever, that no power is above truth. The lesson was painful but necessary. My life has purpose now, thanks to you." As if understanding perfectly, the parrot responded, "Truth sets free, truth sets free." The phrase, never before uttered by the animal, caused gasps in the audience. Was it coincidence or another demonstration of that extraordinary bird's mysterious intelligence? Mrs. Jenkins, now 84 years old, smiled. After so many years, Blue could still surprise her. Perhaps they would never really know how much that parrot understood, how much was mechanical repetition, and how much was genuine understanding, and perhaps that didn't really matter. What mattered was that a simple parrot had triggered a chain reaction that had transformed countless lives, reformed institutions, and reminded everyone of a fundamental truth: that justice, ultimately, doesn't depend on codes, courts, or formal procedures, but on the individual courage to give voice to truth, regardless of how unlikely the messenger may be. At the end of the ceremony, Sarah, Judge Mitchell, Michael, David, Mrs. Jenkins, Blue, and even Richard Harrison posed together for a historic photograph. The image, published in newspapers around the world the next day, was simply titled, "The Extraordinary Case of the Witness Parrot, 10 Years Later." In the small house in Queens that night, Mrs. Jenkins sat on her porch with a view of the river. Blue, as always, rested on her shoulder, the two contemplating the stars in comfortable silence. "You know, Blue, whispered the elderly woman, gently stroking the parrot's feathers. "Sometimes I wonder if you really understood everything that happened, all the impact you caused on justice, laws, and the lives of so many people." The parrot turned his head, looking directly into his caretaker's eyes with that mysterious intelligence that had always characterized him. Then, with perfect clarity, he pronounced, "Blue knows, Blue always knew," and perhaps, reflected Mrs. Jenkins as silent tears rolled down her wrinkled cheeks, that was the greatest truth of all. The end of the story. Dear listeners, what did you think of this incredible story of Blue the parrot? Do you believe an animal can really understand what it witnesses, or was it just an extraordinary coincidence? Leave in the comments your sincere opinions about this case that revolutionized American justice. What moment in the story touched your heart the most? Harrison's transformation, Sarah's dedication, or Mrs. Jenkins' loyalty? Don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other exciting stories like this one. Your company is very important to us. Thank you very much for following the Witness Parrot to the end.